Why did the massive internet influencer Paul Saladino quit the carnivore diet? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. Thanks for sending this video. Dr. Paul Saladino is telling us why he quit the carnivore diet in this video. If you haven't heard about Dr. Saladino, he helped to promote the carnivore diet, has a book on the carnivore diet, and then always consider the source. Best I can tell, Dr. Saladino is a psychiatrist, has never been in a clinical medical weight loss practice that I'm aware of, like mine, for diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity reversal. And we can learn a lot by his seeking out of information, because most doctors do not get nutritional training in medical school. So he had to try to figure this out for himself. Be sure to wait till the end of the video where I kind of put it all together. Before we dive into today's video, I want to invite you to my free webinar, Beyond Cholesterol, the 2 biggest risk factors for cardiovascular disease. If you're confused by cholesterol or feeling pressured by your doctor to take cholesterol medication, this webinar is perfect for you. Discover the crucial facts about why cholesterol isn't the primary concern for cardiovascular disease risk, and learn what you should focus on instead to evaluate and lower your risk. You can sign up below.
Eating a carnivore diet led to full resolution of my autoimmune condition, eczema, itchy rashes, and asthma that I'd had for my whole life. But after a year and a half, I quit the carnivore diet. In this video, I'm going to tell you why and talk about the pros and cons of eating carnivore. So from the outset, I want to say that a carnivore diet, eating only animal foods, meat, fish, chicken, eggs, animal fat, organs, salt plus minus, some people eat coffee on this type of diet, is an incredibly powerful way of eating. It's an elimination diet, and it's helped so many people, including myself, reverse autoimmune diseases, get to the bottom of which foods are triggering their gut issues. It's helped a lot of people lose weight and feel massively better overall. I mean, I am such a fan of the carnivore diet that I wrote a book about it in 2019, which is still something that I'm proud of, and I still agree with many of the ideas talked about in that book.
So let's just consider a moment. You're a physician, you've been trained, and you really didn't get much nutritional information, but you're seeking out reversal of these conditions. And so Dr. Saladino sought information and got so involved in the transformative process, he wrote a book about it, which is no small feat. I have a few books, I contributed to a few books, lots of book chapters and papers, peer-reviewed papers. I went to the scientific experts to try to learn about nutrition. I'm not quite sure where Dr. Saladino went to learn about nutrition, and it may be that he's just talking about his own personal experience here. He is acknowledging that a carnivore diet, not eating plants, can be very helpful. And yet we're going to see a very personalized view of how to change things. And I'm not so sure it's totally based in science.
But if you are eating a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet and you are thriving, this video is not meant to change your mind. If anything, this video is meant to be a high five, keep doing what you're doing, keep thriving, and I'm glad that you found a way of eating that works for you. But I know that, like myself, there are a lot of people who eat carnivore or ketogenic diets and they run into issues. The point of this video is to offer those of you that might be doing carnivore or keto and struggling, maybe with some of the same things that I struggled with, another way or other ways of thinking about diet to help you get back on track for health. Again, this video is not to knock carnivore, it's not to knock keto, it's not to tell you to stop eating that way. If you're thriving, keep doing it. This is what I keep saying in my social media content over and over. If you're thriving, don't change anything about your diet. But if you're not, whether you're having sleep issues or muscle cramps or low libido or weight loss plateau or any of these things, it's time to question your nutritional assumptions, and there are other ways of thinking about diet.
So I love that. So that he's not telling people, everyone, to change based on his own experience. I like that. Also because he didn't come at this from a big weight loss or diabetes reversal story. You got to keep that in mind. And so some people can eat more carbohydrates, and some people can thrive doing that. We've known that for a long time. Some people can eat lower calorie, higher carb, and seemingly be really healthy. There's never been a randomized trial of a really low carb, a little higher carb kind of diet in the long run. I mean, many different dietary changes from the American diet can reverse type 2 diabetes, for example, and take away eczema, that sort of thing that he experienced. So I like that he's giving that acknowledgement that other ways of eating may still be very healthy, although it kind of, if I was a follower, you know, he's very charismatic. So if I didn't know much about food and I am hearing his story, I would be compelled to keep listening because maybe it does apply to me. So always consider, how did he get to where he is? It wasn't massive weight loss journey or diabetes reversal. It was finding a reversal of eczema, things like that, which does go away on a carnivore diet in general.
So what happened with me? After about a year to a year and a half of a carnivore diet, I began to notice issues, probably in my case arising due to electrolyte insufficiency, connected with consistently very low insulin because I wasn't really eating any carbohydrates.
So, time out. When I learned about the low-carb keto diet, in fact, I was kind of pulled aside and taught. Steve Phinney, in the book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living and The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. These are wonderful books if you want to get into more the history and proper use of low-carb diets. Steve says you need 5 to 7 grams of salt a day when you're keto adapted. And the reason for that is the kidneys don't hold on to salt. In fact, we surmise, and Dr. Unwin in the UK surmises, that essential hypertension, essential meaning we don't know why, is actually caused by the insulin holding on to the salt in the context of a low-carb diet. So this is just normal physiology, and Dr. Phinney, Professor Phinney, says you need 5 to 7 grams of salt a day. Now that was translated by Dr. Saladino into some electrolyte insufficiency. Well, if he didn't learn about the amount of salt that you really need, then that might be the major issue, is that it was something that could be fixed relatively easily now that we know. Maybe he would know in retrospect that you need 5 to 7 grams of salt a day. And that seems high by today's standards, perhaps, but that's just the science. So the idea of, I'm thinking that maybe he didn't consult the experts in this kind of diet, maybe internet experts, but not the academic experts, to see if he could solve his problem.
And the protein I was eating probably wasn't as insulinogenic as it needed to be.
I don't understand this. Insulin is released from the pancreas in response to carbohydrate ingestion and protein ingestion. And the response of insulin to carbohydrate is much higher because it's helping to get glucose into the cells. But insulin has always been a factor after protein ingestion to help get amino acids into the cells. And so it facilitates the protein distribution throughout the body. And the idea that you don't have enough insulin, to me, doesn't compute.
This led to muscle cramps. I had problems with sleep. I had heart palpitations, fluttering of my heart. I had something called hypnagogic jerks, where I would fall asleep but jerk myself awake like I was falling multiple times. That was very stressful and very traumatic. It led to very poor sleep for a little while. That eventually was possibly remedied by magnesium IVs, but the reason I got low in magnesium in the first place was probably due to a ketogenic diet in my case. I had declining lab values that were important to me, specifically lower total testosterone, higher sex hormone binding globulin, which leads to a lower free testosterone, and a lower free testosterone index. And I had the sense that I was cold, or a little bit cold, all the time. And when I looked at my labs, my thyroid levels, specifically my total T3 and free T3, were not ideal. In my case, after a year to a year and a half on a ketogenic carnivore diet of only meat, organs, and fat and salt, I began to have some issues, and I started to think about what I could do to remedy those issues.
But these seem to be electrolyte issues. And there are simple ways to overcome that. I will recommend bouillon cubes or crystals or broth paste that you can make into broth, or you can use magnesium. It could be as simple as a pill or a electrolyte milk and magnesia solution. There are even proprietary products now that you can purchase that have flavored electrolytes. So I'm wondering, perhaps all of these things were from an electrolyte imbalance, but was that because there wasn't proper electrolyte input or ingestion? And that is an interesting confusion that I see a lot of people make. That is to say, carbohydrate ingestion can lead to salt and sodium resorption because of insulin. He's saying the insulin was too low. Well, you just add more salt and you don't have that loss of the salt to have to compensate for. So you can accomplish sodium retention by eating carbs. A lot of people feel better after they have carbs, but it's really not the sugar that they're feeling better from. It's that they're holding on to the sodium now and salt and get the volume replacement. The blood volume goes up. But that can be accomplished in the same way by having a bouillon cube in hot water. Both can help you feel better by raising the blood volume. And because carbs are so readily available and people have eaten them for so long, most people, if they're not coached by someone who understands this, will just reach for the carb. They feel better and they say, of course, I need carbohydrate, when really it was the sodium that they needed.
I'll talk about what I think all of these were connected with in this video, but ultimately the solution for me was adding back carbohydrates. If any of you have followed my story in the past, you know where this goes. I've since transitioned to something that I think of as an animal-based diet, where I still eat meat and organs, animal fat and salt, but I get carbohydrates from things like fruit, honey, and raw dairy. And I'll talk about my decisions or why I choose those as my carbohydrate sources later in this video. Now, interestingly, as you can imagine, when I added fruit to my diet and honey to my diet, the carnivore community was a little bit shaken by this, a little bit traumatized, and there were many in the carnivore community, and continue to be those in the carnivore community, suggesting that I did the carnivore diet wrong. Does this sound familiar?
Well, he might have. So I remember a person, a doctor, coming to my office who was shadowing me to learn how I do this and how I implement it and help people. And at the end of the visit, one of the things he said was, you teach people how to cheat. And I said, what do you mean? I don't see it that way. Please explain. And he said, well, you told people they could have a small amount of berries and fruits. Well, so there's really no forbidden food on a low-carb diet. Perhaps in a carnivore, for whatever reason, I don't think it's an ethical, moral, it's more standing on principle, almost cult-like thing. If you eat a little bit of fruit or berries and you're staying under 20 total carbs a day, you'll probably still be in ketosis. So there's no forbidden food if you're doing a low-carb keto diet that doesn't have the only carnivore sort of approach. And so it doesn't disturb me. In fact, I teach doctors that that's one way to give people flexibility. And how many times have I heard, no fruit, what will I do? So you can actually have some of those things and still be in ketosis and lose weight and all that. But I think he's sort of feeling the arrows of all of the carnivores who told him that he's not being carnivore anymore. I don't know that that's scientific.
This is a lot of times what happens in vegan circles when people leave veganism, and then the vegans that are still doing a vegan diet accuse them of doing a vegan diet wrong. People said that I ate too many organs, and that was the reason that I didn't do well on a carnivore diet. Well, I eat the same amount of organs now with carbohydrates, and I feel much better. So I don't think that was the problem. I suppose people have proposed all sorts of other convoluted reasons why a carnivore diet didn't work for me. And as I said in the beginning of the video, I know a carnivore diet works for a lot of people, but I think there are a lot of us out there also that strictly eating meat or eating meat and organs doesn't really cut it long term, because I think that for most people, carbohydrates are a valuable part of human physiology, and I'll talk about why. As I mentioned.
So a couple of things there. Actually, carbohydrates are not essential in the diet. The body can make all of the carbohydrate that it needs. And that I had to learn by traveling to experts and consulting documents that were unbiased. The Institute of Medicine, for example, is an unbiased source of nutritional information here in the US. And in there, it basically says carbs are not essential, meaning you don't have to eat them. Your body can make them. Now, if you want them or you're conditioned to need them, that's an entirely different thing. And part of this, I think, is the suite is calling Dr. Saladino back. I see this all the time in carb addicts who end up in my office with diabetes and obesity and they have trouble giving up sugar or bread or pasta or rice or fruit, all of these, and time goes by, they see the holidays, they get sucked back in. And so often the idea of being just without that for so long sort of tugs people back to the carbs. And no, you don't need to eat carbohydrate, but yes, they are pleasurable to eat. In fact, to the point for some people that they get diabetes and they don't even know or realize that it was the carbs that caused the diabetes. Remember, diabetes is elevated blood sugar. That's the definition. And so cutting sugar out is a great remedy for that. But even better, I think remember, Dr. Saladino is trying to figure out what to do for his own metabolism. Now, the electrolyte thing aside, if you're not doing well on a carnivore diet, try adding in the salt, the proprietary brands that provide the electrolytes, and see if that doesn't fix it. And often that's what it is, not adding the carbs back. Remember that.
As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the main things that went wrong with me was not having enough carbohydrates. And though insulin, a peptide hormone, gets demonized, I think insulin is actually our friend. And I'll talk about why. Since going through all of this on a carnivore diet and beginning to wonder why things went kind of off track for me, especially in terms of my electrolytes, I've since learned that insulin has a crucial role in signaling at the kidney to hold on to electrolytes, specifically sodium, but connected with sodium, insulin is going to affect the resorption, the way your body reabsorbs and holds on to all sorts of electrolytes, all sorts of minerals, sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, and others. And this is essential for optimal human health. This is why I think so many people on ketogenic diets end up having to increase their salt to massive levels because they're not having enough insulin signaling at the level of the kidney. All of this is fixable with carbohydrates in the diet. As you can see from this study, insulin's impact on renal sodium transport and blood pressure at the level of the kidneys that help our body hold on to these minerals. And I want to make it clear that I do not believe that insulin-induced insulin resistance is the reason that some of you may have obesity or diabetes. Insulin-induced insulin resistance, this idea that eating too many carbohydrates leads to insulin resistance in humans, this has really never been shown in real human clinical data.
I disagree. So remember, I think Dr. Saladino is doing the best he can. He consulted the literature, not people or not scientists who have performed those studies, which, is, you do the best you can. So he's looking at a short-term effect of insulin and assuming then if there's not enough insulin, you won't hold on to salt, and yet acknowledging that you just have to have more salt. So fortunately now you can have salt. The term salary actually came from the Roman term for feeding the soldiers salt. That was the salary, that was their payment, because it's so important. And so you could just add a little bit of salt, or again, add the carbs to hold on to the salt, but it's a choice. And the idea though that insulin now is exonerated, again, we're getting to this sort of, going to extremes. Yes, insulin elevation does cause insulin resistance, and the proof of that basically it comes from several areas. I mean, my area of this proof was that I could lower carbohydrate in the food, which lowers the insulin, which lowers the insulin resistance and fixes diabetes and obesity. It all gets better. But now you could say that wasn't the cause or the only cause. I totally agree, but it is a cause. You can reverse insulin resistance by cutting the carbs that raise the insulin. So that's one area of evidence for that. You can give a drug that lowers insulin, and it lowers insulin resistance. That's the octreotide studies. And so actually the powers that be, well, and actually Dr. Saladino can look at papers published by the calories in, calories out crowd, and they'll say there's no evidence, that this insulin causes insulin resistance, when the clinical world, the carbohydrate insulin model group, which have now all come together in a syncretic kind of paper that actually, both are true. You need to, have a lower calories if you're going to lose energy off the body, and carbohydrates raise insulin more than any other macronutrient. It's always been both true. So now I kind of see, well, okay, insulin was bad, now insulin is good. No, it's more Goldilocks, meaning you want it to be somewhere in the middle.
There are other mechanisms at play at the level of mitochondria. If you don't believe me that carbohydrates are benign for humans, things like glucose or fructose or galactose, consider the fact that the human body makes glucose. And if you don't eat it, your body will make it. That is how essential it is to your physiology.
So I don't know, that logic that I've seen used in many different ways. I've used that logic to say cholesterol is good because every cell makes cholesterol. But the idea that since your body makes it, you have to eat it is an entirely different situation. And the body can run just fine without dietary carbohydrate. That's called nutritional ketosis. And many changes occur that actually seem like improving efficiency. And so I don't quite see where he's going with this.
If you fear fructose, I will share a short amount of information in this video to corroborate the assertion that fructose is not harmful for humans, specifically when it is consumed in natural form, quote unquote, in things like fruit and honey, where it always occurs with glucose and it is in a food matrix.
Well, so fructose, if you've seen Rob Lustig, Professor Lustig's video that went viral some years ago, Dr. Lustig talks about fructose acting like alcohol in the liver. So I think what we're seeing is a small amount of something is probably okay. And I totally agree. But so I think Dr. Saladino is being a little defensive against the carnivore critique that these are all going to kill you, like having a strawberry is going to kill you. Well, of course it's not. It may stop the fat burning for a while, depending on how much you have. But I think he's being a little defensive here. The amount matters, and yeah, if you have a lot of fructose, this is not a good thing. And it's kind of interesting to see. I think there's that idea of wanting to have sugar back in the diet, which, it's just being human.
Fructose consumed in that way looks very different in human physiology than free fructose, isolated fructose, or processed fructose, that is high fructose corn syrup. I believe that the vast majority of fructose hate, fructose fearing is based around animal studies in rats and mice, which we know have different physiology. Rats and mice do much more de novo lipogenesis with fructose than humans do, significantly more, meaning they make fructose into triglycerides and fat to a significantly greater extent than humans do. So that physiology in rats and mice is very different than our physiology and is not translated to humans. Or those assertions around fructose are based on high fructose corn syrup, processed sugars, or they are looking at animal models where fructose is overfed in isolation without glucose to animals, leading to fructose malabsorption, and that leads to lipopolysaccharide, and therein lies the problem in animal models very clearly. But I want to clearly state that eating carbohydrates, especially in the form of fruit and honey, is not what caused your diabetes, and it is possible to eat moderate amounts of those while you have diabetes and obesity and become healthier.
So it's possible, but it's not likely. And I have to just say that Dr. Saladino needs to come to my office or to be in a clinic where someone's wearing a continuous glucose monitor. In fact, he could do it as well, and eat some fruit, some fructose and sucrose. Sucrose is in the fruit, which is sucrose is glucose, and fructose. And that's right, there's no just fructose out there, it's in the form of sucrose. So the glucose goes up after eating fruit, depending on the amount. And so that's always the hedge here. but clearly he hasn't been treating diabetes.
So I want to spend a few minutes talking about why I don't think ketogenic diets are ideal for humans. High level, there is evidence in humans that ketogenic diets, that is limitation of carbohydrates, leads to increased stress hormones, that is cortisol, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and glucagon. Now, the cortisol and epinephrine may attenuate long-term, but glucagon is always going to be elevated when you are low carb or limiting your carbohydrates, and glucagon is clearly a stress hormone in humans.
So I remember doing another video response to Dr. Saladino's worry about having a high ferritin level in the blood. I looked into that in greater detail, and the high ferritin in the blood does not really correlate well with high iron in the organs. And so he was worried about hemochromatosis and some long-term problem with ferritin. He's getting worried about blood levels of things that may or may not be relevant in a different context, a different metabolism. And here he's talking about glucagon going up. Well, that's just normal physiology. And again, he's trying to learn normal physiology in nutrition because we just weren't taught this in medical school. And so what happens if you cut carbohydrates out is glucagon goes up, and glucagon actually keeps the blood glucose stable, like rock stable. And so when you're not eating carbohydrates and your CGM looks like this, how can your body know what the glucose should be? It's glucagon. And why don't we talk about glucagon? It's because we don't measure it clinically. Everyone's been focusing on insulin and carbohydrate and insulin and all this. Actually, glucagon is what maintains the normal blood glucose. And it should be a little higher if you're not eating carbohydrates, and that's just fine. There may be these outlying lab values when you compare yourself to carb eaters on the lab report that you look at. Your doctor might see it's out of the quote normal range. Well, that's normal for carb eaters. A very interesting company, ownyourlabs.com, that's collecting information about people who self-describe themselves as eating carnivore or low carb diets. And I look at that not as all these people are abnormal. They're going to be creating a new normal range of people who don't eat carbohydrates, so that you won't have to be freaking out if your blood level of whatever is different than those who eat carbohydrates, but it's in the normal range of those who don't eat carbohydrates. And so I'm afraid Dr. Saladino is just not, he's using small studies or short-term studies, doing the best he can. And what you really want to do is consult the people who, like Rob Lustig, who's been studying fructose and using octreotide to cut insulin down in children. People who are doing those clinical trials, not just people who are reading them and trying to get information from the literature.
There are multiple studies showing that adding carbohydrates to athletes or to humans that are not doing intense exercise improves all sorts of metrics, improves cortisol metrics, improves recovery from exercise, or improves thyroid hormones, this sort of essential thermostat that your body has that tells your body where the metabolic rate should be. And guess what? If you want to stay lean, if you want to be healthy and have energy and feel good and have libido, or if you want to lose weight, you want your body's metabolism to work well. You want your thyroid to be moving your body's thermostat to the highest level possible at all times. So consider some of these downsides of ketogenic diets. Here's a paper: a short-term ketogenic diet impairs markers of bone health. Markers of bone remodeling were impaired after short-term low-carb, high-fat diet. Changes in the thyroid hormonal status in patients receiving ketogenic diet due to intractable epilepsy.
I'm afraid here there's the confusion of a ketogenic diet for epilepsy with a ketogenic diet for obesity and diabetes reversal. It's an entirely different beast. And so that's too bad. I've seen other people make that mistake, even doctors and nutritionists, dietitians who should know better. What I teach has a history going back to the Banting diet and then the Frederick Allen diet, William Osler, for diabetes and obesity reversal, not the ketogenic diet for epilepsy, which is much higher fat level, and you need to worry about being in ketosis all the time, because if you're not in ketosis, you might have a seizure. Well, if you're not in ketosis when you're trying to reverse diabetes, your blood sugar will go up a little bit. It's not like you'll have a seizure, not nearly the same severity of consequence.
Here's another study showing that the thyroid hormones are negatively affected by ketogenic diets. This is done in children. This is done in patients receiving a ketogenic diet due to epilepsy. The conclusions: the ketogenic diet caused thyroid malfunction and L-thyroxine may be required. This is the first report documenting the effect of a ketogenic diet on thyroid function. Thyroid function should be monitored regularly in epileptic patients treated with a ketogenic diet. I would go so far as to say that anyone doing a ketogenic diet, even if that diet is working for you, should have regular checks of TSH, T4, T3, free T3.
So I just don't see this as an issue. I'm afraid, Dr. Saladino, if you had evidence in a clinic and this is an interesting thing, he may be collecting information from comments on videos. And I've noticed that the comments can be coming in, and you have to be very careful about reading comments because you don't get all the information. You're not even able to ask questions of someone to know that that's really what they are seeing. So, a placebo-controlled trial is part of science, because sometimes placebo, or you make a change and you think that's the cause of the change. And you want to be careful about drawing conclusions from anything other than your own data or clinical trials that are well studied.
I have very rarely seen optimal levels, especially of total T3 and free T3, in people doing long-term ketogenic diets, which I think is a real clear signal that our bodies thrive with carbohydrates and see carbohydrates as a signal of abundance.
Well, so again, we're getting into that because it's outside the normal range for those who eat carbohydrates. It must be bad. Just reflecting upon his comment that you want the thermostat to be high all the time. No, actually you don't. I mean, the metaphor that I like to use is like the idle speed on your car. The idle speed, you don't want it super high all the time. I mean, well, you might because you want to lose weight as fast as you can, and people come to me wanting medication to ramp up the metabolism to lose the weight. Well, that's like ramping up your idle speed, and yeah, you'll lose more weight, but at what expense, at what cost? So when your car goes to a stop sign and sits, the idle speed goes down. That's normal. That's what you want, to have a change in this, and I just don't see clinically what he's talking about, which is another internet thing where you can talk about and fearmonger about things without having supportive ammunition or data to support it.
You want your thyroid to work well. We know that when your thyroid is not working optimally, there are increased rates of all sorts of things, especially cardiovascular disease. What about cortisol? Cortisol is very clearly a stress hormone that is absolutely induced when you limit carbohydrates in humans. There are studies like this one: dietary macronutrient content alters cortisol metabolism independently of body weight changes in obese men. As you can see in the conclusions, a low carbohydrate diet alters cortisol metabolism independently of weight loss. In obese men, this enhances cortisol regeneration by 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 1 and reduces cortisol inactivation by A-ring reductases in liver. The authors of this study found that in obese men who were doing low carbohydrate diets, that is 4% carbohydrates, for 4 weeks, levels of cortisol were increased due to reduced inactivation and increased regeneration by an enzyme specifically known as 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase 1. The name of that enzyme isn't important. What is important is the idea that on low carbohydrate diets, more cortisol remains in your body, at least for 4-week trials like this one, because of increased regeneration and decreased deactivation of cortisol. That is not a good thing for humans long term. Excess cortisol leads to all sorts of issues in humans. You do not want your cortisol levels to be higher.
So I don't understand. You talk about a 4-week trial and then you talk about long term as if that is going to be the same. There are a lot of adaptations that change. In fact, if you watch my recent video with Nick Norwitz, he basically checked his own lab test when one of the studies said his interleukin levels would be really low, really high. He checked his own and said, I've been on a keto diet for 5 years and here's my interleukin and it's normal. And in fact, it's really low. So at least we know that study doesn't apply to him. Well, there are a lot of changes that occur, and that particular study was 4 weeks and 17 people. And again, he's doing the best he can, looking at the small, short-term data in the literature that you just got to get past and not be too worried about this.
Obviously, there are some physiologic utilities to cortisol, specifically a cortisol awakening response first thing in the morning that helps wake you up, but consistently elevated cortisol levels due to stresses induced in the body by limitation of carbohydrates is probably not a good thing for many humans. Returning to the idea of thyroid, specifically, here's another study showing that in 6 healthy males with 11 days of 3 diets, all having the same amount of calories and differing amounts of carbohydrates, specifically 85, 44, and 2% carbohydrates. So in this study, there were healthy males who had 11 days of 3 different diets based on their carbohydrate levels. 85% as carbohydrates, 44% as carbohydrates, and 2% as carbohydrates. And what they found was that all of these diets were isocaloric, but in the lowest level of carbohydrates, what they found was in the men who had levels of carbohydrates at 2% in their diet, there was increased protein catabolism, that is increased breakdown of protein, and lowering of the hormone T3. So very clear in this study that low carbohydrate diets increased protein catabolism and lowered thyroid hormones like T3.
After 11 days. So I'm just not compelled or worried about that. I remember now a statement that you should end every paper, which is under the conditions studied. And it will lower your likelihood of overgeneralizing anything. And so in this case, in 11, we know that keto adaptation might take 6 months for full muscle keto adaptation. The muscle can actually improve its fat burning over a 6-month period. This was a movie called Serial Killers 2, where 2 triathlete champions, husband-wife team, actually keto adapted to then go into a rowboat and row from San Francisco to Hawaii. You can watch this documentary film and see what they went through, and it took them 6 months before they went into the boat because they didn't want to go too early, and their bodies, their muscles basically became better at burning fat over that period of time. So hopefully when you're reading data, when you're looking at studies, you're looking at news, and you see an 11-day study, you can just kind of turn the page.
It's also been noted repeatedly in exercise studies in men that giving carbohydrates improves free testosterone and decreases cortisol after intensive exercise training. Here's a study showing an example of that. And in those who are exercising or doing intense exercise of any kind, carbohydrate clearly improves the attenuation of the immune system after those exercises. As you can see here in this study very clearly, the authors say consuming carbohydrate, but not glutamine or other amino acids during exercise attenuates the rise in stress hormones, meaning that the stress hormones went up less, such as cortisol, and appears to limit the degree of exercise-induced immunosuppression, at least for non-fatiguing bouts of exercise.
So again, if you're going to the literature, you're trying to learn about nutrition and physiology because we just weren't taught that in medical school. But here is did you see the journal year was the year 2000. Very interesting thing that going to the library is what I used to do, like photocopy articles. Now you have the internet. You can get access to information. It's a wonderful and terrible thing all at the same time. And if there's one study, and it was done 24 years ago, it's the year 2000, and you don't see that there are other studies, or you don't have a meta-analysis of studies to kind of put them all together, you never really know if that was a real signal. But then also fields, scientific paradigms change over time. And in that same series of movies, Serial Killers 2 was the rowboat. They broke the world's record by 15 days, rowing from San Francisco to Hawaii. In Serial Killers, Professor Timothy Noakes, who taught a generation of people to carb load before exercise, again, these are paradigms that shift, recants, and he pulls out the chapter on carb loading in the movie and says, I was wrong, you should not eat carbs, you should be going into exercise running on fat for fuel. And so I think there's a paradigm changing here, even in exercise, in the idea of ketones giving you an edge. It's actually going to be interesting to see how that evolves.
Now, for the sake of scientific experimentation, I've put white rice into my diet sometimes, and I'll tell you guys that I just don't feel as good with white rice the majority of the time when I eat it. So generally, I don't eat white rice, and my carbohydrates come from fruit and honey and raw milk. Again, do what works for you, but know that the grains, that is oats, wheat, quinoa, rice, these do have more defense chemicals and will need more rigorous processes to be detoxified. If you're having gut issues, if you're having headaches or fatigue, or unresolved autoimmune issues, a lot of times getting rid of those is a good idea. The same goes for beans. I've done many videos on beans, why I'm not a huge fan of beans at all. Beans contain significant amounts of phytic acid, digestive enzyme inhibitors, and I think they are a very poor source of nutrition for humans. Again, like the grains, you must go through a rigorous process to detoxify beans. This isn't to say that some people, if they want to soak their beans for 4 or 5 days at 45 degrees centigrade and then put them in an acid solution to sprout them for a day and then pressure cook them, you might be able to eat some beans that are reasonably non-toxic for humans, but that is a lot of work, and clearly those beans do not want to get eaten by humans. So
that's an interesting anthropomorphication. The beans don't want to be eaten by humans. Well, come on. Well, so I was taught that beans and rice came about to overlap the deficient amino acid in each other so that you get a complete protein with all of the protein amino acids that you need. And so there are a lot of combinations of vegetables that you can, because there are very few vegetables that have all of the amino acids. So beans and rice came about relatively recently, even though people will say, you know, I'm from the Caribbean, I'm from Africa, I'm from India, I need my rice. Well, that's a habit, that's a socialization, that's a cultural thing, not a requirement for humans to have. And the same with the beans. And so while you may be accustomed to it and you like it, if it's not healthy, like Dr. Saladino, I think it's a doctor's job to call out the possibility that the food that you eat might be contributing to your poor health. So agree with these comments about the vegetables.
It's not that you can't eat sources of carbohydrates like grains or beans. It's just that they require much, much more intensive preparation to actually be less toxic for humans than things like fruit and honey, and I'll get to those in a moment. For some people, root vegetables are better tolerated than grains or beans, and I think this is reasonable. If you can do white potatoes and you pressure cook them and you're fine with them, great. When I've tried to eat white potatoes, it seems to re-trigger my eczema, so I think that for me at least, this nightshade type of root is not agreeing with my body and my immune system. Again, some people do fine with it. So see what works for you in terms of carbohydrates, but I do think having some sources of carbohydrates in your diet will improve your overall health.
The nightshades, he mentions potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, and tobacco. These are nightshade vegetables. They may trigger arthritis, other issues. So it's not just potatoes. And yes, sweet potatoes are like potatoes.
The reasons that I've selected fruit and honey is because to me it just makes sense intuitively that these are the foods that plants kind of want us to eat. Fruit is the colorful seasonal part of fruits.
So again, Dr. Saladino comes up with these because fruits, want you to eat them. Beans don't want. That's not really very scientific. Although I give some element of, how should I say, credibility or validity to the ideas of history, of, fruit hasn't been around in the form that it's in now. It's been changed through monoculture or through genetic breeding, even GMO kinds of changes. But so the fruit 100 years ago looked very different than it does now, meaning you would have much less of it and it might not even be sweet. But the other ideas of hunter-gatherer, paleo, primal, I have some level of confidence from that. If we had evolved and lived in a world where it was just fruit, that wouldn't make sense physiologically because actually we're made of protein. So the human body needs amino acids and fats to be able to rebuild itself and to replenish the structural elements of it. Carbohydrate really is just a fuel source. And so, the physiology and the history kind of fit together with the paleo, primal, hunter-gatherer idea. Not that the idea that fruit is, plants want you to eat them. So that, I don't know.
Remember that humans evolved at the equator for most of our existence, so I think that all of us have the mechanisms to eat fruit in significant amounts. If you don't want to eat fruit that's out of season where you are, that's great, but I don't think many of us need to go to that level of stringency with regard to our fruit consumption. Some people don't tolerate all fruit as well as other fruits, but see what works for you. Honey is something that, again, is available all year round at the equator. When I was in Africa with the Hadza, they loved honey. They ate it without any remorse, and I got to share honeycomb with actual larvae in it. And we also got honey from stingless bees, and that honey was some of the best I've ever had in the world.
So I've seen this repeated where, again, trying to find the best information someone can. They seek out cultures around the world that seem to be eating the way that they did for a long period of time. So Dr. Saladino visits the Hadza tribe where they have honeycomb and they have honey, and therefore everyone should have honey. Well, wait a minute. There are other tribes that don't have honey and they thrive. There are some tribes that drink the milk and the blood of the cow traditionally, but now that they have porridge or oatmeal, how do you not have that? So the introduction of Western foods has changed a lot of it. But still, it's interesting to see him seeking to find the answer out there when I think he's finally finding the answer internally for him, which is to add some carbs. It's okay. Just have some carbs.
When it comes to fruit, people get kind of triggered, especially in ketogenic and carnivore circles. But the fact remains that there are no well-conducted studies in humans showing that fruit or fruit juice induce any degree of metabolic dysfunction. Now, even in the fructose-fearing world, many of the pundits will say that fruit is okay because it contains fiber, which is not something I'm going to address in this podcast necessarily. I'm not a huge fan of fiber, but if you want to get some fiber in your fruit, that's great. But fruit juice is almost unanimously vilified. I don't really understand why, because when you look at the literature, there are studies upon studies showing that fruit juice is helpful for humans in so many different ways. There are studies showing that watermelon juice improves heart rate variability during an oral glucose challenge.
So now I'm beginning to wonder if he's getting money from the juice industry, because all you need is a continuous glucose monitor treating someone with diabetes, and you'll see that the juice raises the blood glucose, and diabetes is a problem of elevated blood glucose. That's not to say that in a different population, and perhaps for Dr. Saladino, that his glucose goes up and the insulin goes up to keep it down, so you don't even see a glucose elevation. Well, that works if your metabolism is that way.
And actually attenuates many of the problems that happen when you give somebody pure glucose in a glucose challenge. There are multiple studies with orange juice showing that it improves total antioxidant status and decreases lipid peroxidation in humans. There are studies with cherry juice showing decreased levels of lipid peroxidation as well. There are studies showing that 100% fresh orange juice improved blood glucose and improved insulin levels in healthy subjects. And there are other studies showing that orange juice ingestion decreased lipid peroxidation. So
again, these are studies that are not relevant to the treatment of diabetes. If it's pre-diabetes, you don't have to worry too much, you lose weight, yes, you probably can eat these foods. But in the context of a low-carb diet, where you're having natural appetite suppression, you're getting people to lose weight, eat less, and have the blood sugars come down, then you can't have these things. So again, it's the context. And I think we're getting to the realization, Dr. Saladino was getting to the realization that he can tolerate these foods. He may not have needed to do the carnivore diet in the first place. That's my hunch.
In healthy adult women, this is just the tip of the iceberg, guys. There are probably 30 to 40 studies with fruit juice alone showing that fruit juice improves everything from lipid peroxidation, glucose indices, insulin sensitivity, and endothelial function. Fruit juice, especially when raw and fresh and not contaminated with processed sugars or high fructose corn syrup, looks to be healthy for humans. Then people will say, well, what about honey Honey can't possibly be healthy for humans. Honey is known to raise testosterone levels in men, which is probably a good thing. Honey has even been studied in human randomized controlled trials in diabetics and found to lower fasting blood glucose. Yes, I said lower fasting blood glucose. In an 8-week trial, patients were given up to 125 to 150 grams of honey per day at the end of the trial, and they ended up with lower fasting glucose at the end of the trial. Now, notably in this trial, the hemoglobin A1C, an average reflection of the blood sugar, was slightly higher, about 7 to 10 milligrams per deciliter higher blood glucose equivalents in patients getting the honey, which is not surprising when you give a diabetic more carbohydrates, that their blood sugar would be slightly higher, but their fasting blood glucose was lower, suggesting improved insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, I don't agree with that at all. So just...
And I suspect that even in diabetics, moderate amounts of honey could be used long-term without any detrimental effects, potentially positive effects. And in fact, there are entire reviews written, like this one, a review of the protective effects of honey against metabolic syndrome. So it's very clear that there's a significant amount of evidence that both fruit and honey can improve all sorts of metrics in line with improved metabolic health in humans. One caveat: adjust your carbohydrate intake to you, to your lifestyle, to how active you are. I think some people have criticized my lifestyle.
Well, so he is saying, what I would say is you have to be careful of the context. So if you have diabetes, don't listen to him. He's not treating people with diabetes. He has a following who came to this for various reasons, maybe because of his lifestyle. Hey, let's learn about this.
Or my recommendation for people to consider adding carbohydrates in the form of fruit and honey or raw milk back to their diets by saying that I'm active or that I live in a place near the equator and I'm getting lots of sun. And I think that those criticisms are well taken, but generally inaccurate.
So again, I think he's a little defensive. My understanding is that he's a surfer and now lives in Costa Rica, which is great. I mean, I wish we all could do that. But again, consider the context that when you're active, you can eat more carbohydrates and you don't store it. If you come to a certain way of eating, trying to fix eczema, where you're not trying to lose weight, reverse diabetes, you can eat more carbohydrates. And so there's actually a whole field of lower carbohydrate diets, low glycemic index, low carb diets, low carb ketogenic diets. Dr. Saladino came into this through the lens of the carnivore, so that he went into the low carb keto diets. And now he's learning that there are higher carb diets, but they're still low carb compared to what he used to eat. And yeah, some people with the correct metabolism, some people who naturally want to exercise can eat more carbohydrates and apparently be healthy.
No matter where you live, no matter how active you are, including some carbohydrates in your diet is a reasonable thing.
I don't agree. I mean, so again, consider the audience here. You know, you would say some things in a certain audience, you wouldn't say other things. So you're watching this because you're a patient of mine or you're trying to learn more about low carb diets. You want to match the carbohydrate intake to the metabolism. And if you're trying to lose weight or reverse diabetes, you want to be careful to not eat much carbohydrate if you're using a low carb diet. So these are the rules that we teach, at least for diabetes weight loss reversal, weight loss phase, and then you can consider back eating carbs if you like.
Do you need as many carbohydrates as me? No, you don't. But getting some in your diet, I believe, will help if you are struggling with any of the issues or any of these problems that I mentioned or something like these on a carnivore or ketogenic diet. That's again why I'm doing this whole video. When I talk about fruit and honey, some people mention concerns about deuterium. I'll just say briefly about deuterium that I think that the best way to lower your body's levels of deuterium are to have your mitochondrial electron transport chain work very well to make the metabolic water at the end of the electron transport chain, which will be deuterium depleted. And in order to do that, I believe there is strong biochemical and physiologic evidence in humans that you should be eating carbohydrates. I think that if you want to spend tons of money shipping deuterium depleted water across the world, you can. But I don't believe that fruit and honey will have any significant effect on the deuterium levels in most people's bodies, especially in the context of your overall metabolic health and the degree to which your mitochondria work. Some people have also looked at fruit and honey and had fears that they would increase glycation I don't think there's any solid evidence that it happens at all. There's actually evidence that fructose decreases hemoglobin A1C in humans. And on the flip side, something that I don't think is talked about enough is the idea that ketogenic diets increase advanced glycation end products, specifically things like methylglyoxal, which are not great for humans. As we can see from studies like this, ketogenic diets lead to increased methylglyoxal in the human body. So if you're worried about advanced glycation end products, I would worry a lot less about fruit and honey and a lot more about being in ketosis.
Did you catch 14 to 28 days? Turn the page.
Glyoxal, as you can see in this study, not a good thing in terms of aging and oxidative stress. You do not want more methylglyoxal being produced in your body. And as you saw in the first study, ketogenic diets clearly increase the amount of methylglyoxal in your cells and in your organism.
So, I've seen this in the vegetarian, vegan sort of commentary where they'll focus on the reductionist idea of we'll measure one biomarker, one thing, and we'll show that it's bad in 10 days and ergo that diet is bad forever. This is just, it's not very compelling to me. Sure, it's science, but it's not a very high level of science. And people are doing the best they can, but also people are doing studies, taking pot shots with agendas other than human health. And I still, Dr. Saladino talks about not good for humans and all this. Maybe that's the language that his followers have been accustomed to. It doesn't sit well with me.
So at the end of all of this, let me return to the first thing I said. Carnivore diet significantly improved my eczema. I believe that ketogenic diets, carnivore diets have helped so many people. But if you are struggling on these diets, understand that they don't work for everyone. Yes, there is bioindividuality, and perhaps there are some people for which these diets work better than others. Maybe my genes were not adapted to a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet as well as yours. To those of you who are doing carnivore diets and ketogenic diets and thriving, like I said in the beginning, awesome. Keep going. This video is for those in the space who may be thinking about those diets, who may be doing those diets and not finding the results that they want. They may be having low thyroid symptoms, low sex hormone symptoms, low libido, sleep disturbances, weight loss plateaus. And for the reasons I outlined in this video, increased cortisol, decreased thyroid hormone production, increased SHBG, decreased testosterone production, possibly increased advanced glycation end products, coupled with the fact that I don't think you need to fear fruit and honey, natural sources of sugar, lead me to suggest that if you're struggling on either one of those diets, that you consider something like an animal-based diet. Organs, meat, fruit, honey, raw dairy. There are different sources of carbohydrates that you can include. Ultimately, this is about experimenting, figuring out what works for you, but I think it's important to put ideas into this space to offer people levers to pull to try and understand what may be best for you. So with that, that's what I humbly offer is my story of why I quit the carnivore diet. I believe it's a very valuable, powerful way of eating for a lot of people, but I think there's more to the story and there are better ways to adjust our diets for most humans. See you guys in the next video.
Fascinating. I know putting it all together, Dr. Saladino never needed the carnivore diet or never needed a keto diet metabolically. If you grow up naturally exercising, the consensus view is that you're able to access your fat stores. You're metabolically flexible. So if you grew up with a heavy story, you were a fat storer, you took carbs and you stored and you didn't naturally want to exercise, it's a different metabolism. And so those who grow up heavy, they're not the natural exercisers, do better on lower carbohydrates. Those who do exercise naturally and can have more carbohydrates. In fact, in my book, End Your Carb Confusion, we have you take a quiz to show or direct you toward a higher level, moderate level, or really low level of carbs, end your carb confusion. And I wish, and in fact, I'll send Dr. Saladino a book if he wants, because basically he should have taken the quiz and he would have sorted out into a moderate to high level of carb consumption from the get-go. And he wouldn't have had to go through the very low carnivore, adding more low glycemic now to low carb. He could have just kind of matched taking the quiz in our book and figured it out. And yet again, he is a seeker, a teacher, wants to teach people through his own experience, which is what a wonderful gift. But he finally found that he does better, given his lifestyle, with higher carbs. That's good. And that may be a lesson for all of us, where you can be using a therapeutic keto diet and you might stay on that forever. Or you might want to add carbohydrates back, but you don't have to. And that's a big change from 20 years ago, before we started doing research on low-carb diets. Back 20 years ago, it was taboo to stay on a keto diet more than 2 weeks. And now I follow people who've been on keto diets for 2 decades. So a lot has changed. The paradigms shift as science progresses, and hopefully we'll get the answer to be able to metabolically match diets to individuals. Right now, what we do is we give a recommendation and then see how you do. It's trial and error to find the right fit. But I found that to be kind of an interesting look into how research, short-term and agenda-driven, can lead people to often see what they want to see. And I think for many reasons, to be more athletic, to have the sweetness. Finally, Dr. Saladino found where he should be, and I don't think these other mechanisms really apply to those who don't have his metabolism and need a keto diet for improvement in a myriad of other different issues. I hope that's helpful, and please like, subscribe, ring the notification bell. I'm dropping new videos on Wednesdays and Fridays. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.